There is so much going on around the world at the moment that is causing so many people so much grief. You know, with some people this year, life has been kind of pretty normal. Life as usual, good times. But you know what? For others, life has treated them very unfairly. Many have lost their homes and businesses and even their lives just because someone in their government decided to provoke a war or to launch a war, such as in the Ukraine and in Gaza and elsewhere. Others have had their lives devastated by, illnesses or, by a drunken driver killing someone that they loved, or a child molester, or, the list can just go on and on about the unfair circumstances that people have had to endure. Truth is that life is often simply not fair. And this brings us to perhaps the hardest to answer frequently asked question: why is life so unfair for some people? And I wish that I had a simple, 3-point sermon to adequately address this question, but you know what? I don't. I think it's one of those questions that, probably many of us intend to ask God when we see Him face to face. Having said that, I do have a feeling that, that we will be so overcome with the look of our new home in heaven that we will forget all of those kinds of questions. But in the meantime, many of us have had no choice but to wonder, why life can in fact be so hard for some people, so good for others, and yet so hard for some. Many of you may know the story of Joni Eareckson Tada. Yes. She was a vivacious and athletic young woman who just loved life. She also loved riding horses and hiking and tennis and swimming. She was good at so many things. She had short blonde hair and a face that kind of made any photographer look talented. But on a hot July afternoon in 1967, at the age of just 18, Joni dove into a shallow lake and her life was changed forever. She suffered a spinal cord fracture that left her paralyzed from the neck down, without the use of her hands or legs. For the last 57 years, Joni has been a quadriplegic. At 74 years of age, she is still a very beautiful woman, but she can do very little for herself. She can't turn over in bed. She can't brush her own teeth. She can't apply her own makeup. Each morning it requires 2 hours and 7 helpers to just get her ready for her day. On top of this, pain has become a constant companion for her. Every day of her life she's become more aware than most people of the knowledge that, she's living on borrowed time. A broken bone, a collapsed lung, or an infection could put her into the hospital for months. Anyone who hears Joni's story is likely to think, as I did, it just doesn't seem fair. And you know what? It actually wasn't and isn't fair. And yet, despite the unfairness, despite the suffering, Joni has an incredible ministry and has accomplished so much more from within her wheelchair than most normal people with both their legs and arms working have done. But still, there's no denying it. No getting around the fact that from the age of 18, she's had a really raw deal. And of course, there's also no denying that many others like her have also had a raw deal. I mean, Nick Vujicic is another example of life just not being fair. He was born with no arms and no legs. Now, in anybody's language, that is certainly not fair. And yet, despite the unfairness, he, like Joni, also has a wonderful ministry, and he's been a very effective witness for Jesus and a great inspiration to millions of people all around the world. Local guy from the Sunshine Coast. He's now going all over the world, sharing how Jesus can make a difference to someone's life. Yes, we live in a world where oftentimes the playing field is just not at all level. And some people end up suffering to a much greater degree than other people do, and it's hard to have an answer when they ask you why. Why me? What can we say to the parents of those children that have been diagnosed with a fatal disease? What can we say to the man who's just discovered that his wife has been cheating on him? What can we say to the 35-year-old parent with kids that has been told that they have cancer and 6 months to live? Well, the truth is that we don't have adequate answers to these kinds of questions. I've often been asked, why would God allow this or that to happen? And my answer has to be, I don't know. Because the truth is, I sometimes find myself asking those questions. But other times there is a pretty clear answer. And in a few minutes, I want to look at some, possible answers or reasons for some of the tough situations that people often face. And I know it's not going to satisfy us, but it might help. And before we do, I want us to first consider a couple of assumptions that are just plain wrong and invalid. And these are assumptions that some people make that actually make the tough situations worse. And they're assumptions that are made both by Christian and non-Christian people alike. And the first is that all suffering comes from God or is caused by God or allowed by God in some way. A young person gets caught up in a car accident. A family loses a child. A friend is diagnosed with cancer, and someone is likely to ask, why would God do that to them? But the fact is that in most circumstances, God has absolutely nothing to do with it. Old Testament history does show that God was indeed behind some events that caused suffering when He had reason to punish people and even punish whole nations, and at one stage punished the whole world, as He did with Noah's flood. But there is nothing in the Bible to suggest that God is responsible for all the bad things that go on in the world. Far from it. The truth is that we live in a world that we were given dominion over. And God has never taken that away from us. If I were to give you my car, I don't have the right then to tell you how to drive it and where to park it and whether to wash it or not. If I've given it to you, it's yours. And so God gave us this world, and He gave us authority over it, and He's never taken that away from us. But we allowed our world to become infested with sin, and the result of sin is always decay and immorality and injustice and brokenness and pain and anguish and eventually death. After Adam and Eve sinned, they opened the gateway to evil, which the world has been infested with ever since. Not everyone on earth is evil, but evil tends to spill over from one evil person to an innocent person all the time. And so many people are impacted by evil even when they haven't done evil themselves. The second wrong assumption is that real, true Christians should be blessed and shouldn't ever suffer. That if you suffer, it's because you're somehow not right with God or you've got some sin going on in your life. Some people will wrongly teach, and others will wrongly assume that a life spent with God should simply not include suffering, that it should only be all about prosperity and good health and everything else. Well, that is really a lovely thought, and I wish that it were true. I do, because I don't like suffering. I don't like going without, so I'm all for that. I'm all for not suffering, but go and tell that to the very first disciples. Tell that and tell that to the countless other brothers and sisters that have been tortured and even lost their lives since those first disciples, not because they've sinned, but just because of their faith in Jesus Christ. Truth is that nowhere in the Bible do we see a promise that if we love God that we won't suffer. In fact, if you study the whole Bible, and not just those, favorite scriptures that we all like to read and memorize, but if you read the whole thing, you'll discover that life with God will definitely sometimes include suffering. Look at Job. What did God say about Job? The most righteous man on earth. And look what he went through. Now, of course, this fact doesn't make for popular sermons, but it's the truth nonetheless. It was true for Job. It was true for David and for Joseph and for Abraham and for Moses and for Jesus. And of course, the list could go on and on, right up to this very day. In fact, it seems that almost every single one of the men and women who fervently followed Jesus when he was here on earth ended up becoming martyred for his or her faith. Now, the question that most of us have probably pondered is, why are some people who love God so blessed while others who also love God seem to suffer so much? Well, I don't know. What I do know is that to think that life is always going to be fair because we're Christians is simply untrue. And it's unrealistic. No matter what those internet TV preachers might try to tell you. So what are the reasons, if any, for suffering? Is there any purpose in it? Some of us and many others know through our own experience that very often suffering can happen through no fault of our own. It can happen because of the wrong decisions that other people make, which impact us and which we are powerless to do anything about. This happens when we suffer because of the choices that other people in our lives make. Sometimes it's not even because of people in our lives, but people that our lives collide with. On the other hand, I'm sure that we can all accept that sometimes people suffer because of their own poor decisions. And the Bible has quite a lot to say about suffering that is caused by people's own wrong choices. Gamblers end up in poverty, dragging their families down with them because they keep gambling even though they keep losing. They find this delusion that if I just make one more bet, I'll make up all my losses. And so that keeps them going until they have nothing left. Adulterers can lose contact with their families, their children, lose the support of their children. And some can end up in jail because of, greedy, illegal choices that they've made. Others, because of temper tantrums, can end up hurting people and then suffer the consequences for doing that. Others have suffered financial ruin because of unwise or risky decisions, and others may have suffered loss because of their own choice to maybe drink and then drive, and so on. These are examples of how suffering can be the direct result of people's own bad choices. There are some kinds of suffering that we can see biblical reasons for, and I'm going to share with you at least 4 biblical reasons that can be seen as reasons behind suffering. Now, of course, these don't cover every possible reason for suffering, because most people will suffer for reasons that are unknown to us and will probably remain that way. Sometimes the question why just kind of hangs in the air, and we've got no choice but to just live with it. But other times there are, pretty clear answers or reasons the Bible speaks to. And the first is to reinforce that our actions or our choices do indeed have consequences. How many of you experienced that some of the choices you made had consequences? Some of them have been good consequences. You make a good choice, you get a good result. But some of them have been bad choices and they have had bad consequences. If you beat your wife, it should come as no surprise when she leaves you and takes half of your possessions with her. If you've been smoking for years, you shouldn't be surprised if the doctor ends up telling you that you've got lung cancer. If you drive over the speed limit, sooner or later you're going to get a fine. If you drive while drunk, you'll be more likely to have an accident and end up losing your license. If you lie, steal, or cheat, it's going to come back to bite you one day. Proverbs 6, verse 27 and 28 says, "Can a man scoop a flame into his lap and not have his clothes catch on fire? Can he walk on hot coals and not blister his feet?" I mean, this is all basic, obvious stuff. Do you have to put this in the Bible? But what it's really talking about is consequences. It's making us realize, hey, if you do something, there's going to be a consequence. The Bible's very clear about this. The choices that we make have consequences. If you're involved in sexual sin, there are consequences. If you're married, you're asking for a divorce. If you're promiscuous, you might get a sexually transmitted disease. You might even get AIDS that can take your life away. A child might be conceived when you're not ready for it. Families could be torn apart. If you watch any TV, you'll be convinced that adultery is, an everyday occurrence these days. TV tries to make us think that adultery is just, part of socially accepted life these days. And it might be for some, but it's not for us. And it seems clear that those who get involved in adultery don't always think about the possible consequences. But the Bible makes it clear the consequences are pretty clear. Proverbs 6, verse 33 says, "But the man who commits adultery is an utter fool, for he destroys himself. He will be wounded and disgraced. His shame will never be eased." Or erased, I should say. No, you don't come off something like adultery scot-free. You will end up being wounded, even though at first you might think it's not going to happen. There are many other biblical examples that warn us about the consequences of certain actions. And in such cases, one of the reasons that we experience suffering in life is just to remind us that when we break God's principles or standards, that there are consequences for those breaches. And of course, this is not just for Christians, but it's for people out in the street who don't accept that God even exists. The fact that they don't accept God exists doesn't mean that they escape the consequences of when they breach God's laws. Now, most people will not have any problem at all accepting the fairness of this kind of, self-inflicted suffering. And that, of course, is understandable. We even have a saying for that, something that along the lines of, well, he or she brought it on themselves. We've heard people say that. But then there's also the kind of suffering that others have caused you, and yet God has this amazing ability to bring good out of those situations and make us stronger and better people afterwards. For example, let's say a young woman experienced a painful divorce. She was deserted by her husband when she was 3 months pregnant, and she already had a 2.5-year-old little boy to deal with. And so the struggles of the next few years on her own were pretty brutal. And yet out of them grew an understanding and sympathy for the needs of divorced and single mothers, which led to the birth of an active personal ministry and a book on how Christians individually and as congregations can minister to the suddenly single woman or single mother. What started as a painful experience grew into a rewarding purpose for her life. Now, I remember when Pastor Bernie ended up in hospital, seriously ill, and only hours away from possibly losing her life. That's what the doctors told me. And she told me when she came out of that situation that she was then able to just understand what people go through when they end up in hospital. And so she came out of that situation with the ability to have much more compassion for the sick. Her illness was able to become a gain for her in that way. Truth is that with human nature being what it is, we can always relate better to someone else's suffering if we have suffered ourselves. And there's a verse that reminds us about this truth from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 and 4. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort that God has given us. And this is particularly relevant, of course, when we're ministering to an unbeliever who's suffering. We can share how God got us through the same situation and therefore provide comfort out of our own experience. You know, Bernie's illness wasn't her fault. The tragedy of the divorced mother wasn't her fault. Just like the man that Jesus healed who was born blind wasn't his fault for being blind. Situations like this need not be explained by some possible sin, but can be seen as God's avenue for blessing, or an avenue for their blessing. Not only for them, but also for others. You know, after Jesus healed that blind man, the neighbors were stunned. They couldn't believe what happened, and so they brought the man to the Pharisees to just see what they thought about this incredible thing that Jesus had done to this man. Later we see that the man became a Christian and a worshiper of Jesus. And so not only did he get his sight, but he got a new life and an eternal destiny. There's a powerful Bible verse that offers hope to anyone suffering or going through tough experiences. And I've got to tell you, it's one of my favorite promises because it has helped me a great deal when I've been going through it. It's helped me get a better perspective when I've been going through the ringer. And it's Romans 8 verse 28, and it says that we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. How many of you know that for God to bring good out of something, it's got to be bad? Why would you bring good out of good? So it's got to be something bad going on in your life, and yet God is able to somehow bring good out of that. And I've experienced that in my life, and I know some of you have also. Let's take a moment to see how, this particular verse played out in just Joni Eareckson Tada's life. There is no doubt that her driving accident was a tragedy at only 18 years of age. But look what God brought out of her changed circumstances. A fuller and more rewarding life than many people without her disability will ever have. She learned to paint with a brush between her teeth. And she got so good at it that she actually began selling her artwork. To date, she has written over 40 books. She's recorded several musical albums. She starred in a movie about her life and is an advocate for disabled people. She's a great example of what God can do with someone's tragedy when they hand their lives over to Him. Tada wrote of her experiences in her 1976 international best-selling autobiography, Joni, the unforgettable story of a young woman's struggle against quadriplegia and depression. Big title for a book. But this book has been distributed in many languages. The book was made into a 1979 feature film of the same name starring herself. So she even became a movie star. Her second book, A Step Further, was released in 1978. She married Ken Tada in 1982, and in 2010 she announced that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer, but she emerged successfully from cancer surgery and is still going strong at 74. Tada founded Joni and Friends in 1979, a ministry to the disabled community throughout the world. In 2006, the Joni and Friends International Disability Center in Agoura, California was established. The center runs 4 programs, Joni and Friends, an award-winning daily 5-minute radio program that's heard in over 1,000 radio stations. The Wounded Warrior program offers family retreats. Wheels for the World collects wheelchairs which are refurbished by prison inmates and then donated to people in developing nations where physical therapists fit each chair to the needy disabled child or even adults. In 2005, Tada was appointed to the Disability Advisory Committee of the U.S. State Department. Tada is a popular conference speaker. Her articles have been published in Christianity Today, Today's Christian Woman, The War Cry by Salvation Army, and many newspapers around the world. Tada has appeared 4 times on the Larry King Live Show. Yes, God brought good out of her tragic situation. Would Joni have been better off if God had just healed her at the age of 18? No doubt Joni herself would have been better off, but not the countless thousands of lives that she has touched and changed from within her wheelchair. Amazing. History has proven that there are times when certain bad experiences happen that then become kind of the platform for the power of God to be displayed to the world around us. Think about Joseph in the Old Testament. Think about what he went through and the horrible experiences that he had. As a young boy, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery by his own family, by his own brothers. Then he was shipped to a foreign country. He's accused of attempted rape and then thrown in prison for it and just forgotten that he was even there. And so he faced the worst circumstances that you can imagine. But Joseph came through all of those experiences and ended up second in command of the whole nation of Egypt, which at the time was the greatest ruling empire on earth. When he came face to face with his brothers who were responsible for his downward, cycle of disaster, he said to his brothers in Genesis 50 verse 20, he said, you intended harm for me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. What an attitude. God was glorified by Joseph and his family, and through his story, God has been glorified over and over again from one generation to another, including our own, because of what took place in his life. And so the first reason for some suffering is to remind us of how our actions have consequences. The second is to show how God can work through any person despite the severity of their tragedies or suffering. And the third is to reveal the genuineness of our faith. There are those certain times when God allows us to go through certain trials of life. Or sometimes He even sends those trials our way to reveal, strengthen, and solidify our faith in Him. See, the truth is, when life is wonderful and everything's going well, who needs faith? We don't even need God, let alone faith, when life is going good. St. Peter, who himself had become quite accustomed to suffering, being beaten, thrown into jail just because of his faith in Jesus. And so Peter developed a perspective on this point, and he tells us so in 1 Peter 1 verse 6 and 7. Go back. Oops, here we go. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proven genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Now I confess this is not my favorite passage. I don't even like it, actually. But you know what? We all need to know it. Because at some stage or other, suffering will happen to the best of us. The people Peter originally addresses here were living in persecution from the authorities just because of their faith. And yet Peter says that the trials that they are enduring would only make them stronger. He points them to the joy to come when the trials will be no more and they will be able to experience true peace and prosperity in the presence of God Himself. A fourth reason for suffering is to remind us that we are temporal in this life but eternal in the next. One of the hardest things for me to deal with as a pastor is when people come to me who have been crushed or heartbroken by something or someone or some news, and they look to me hoping that I have some answer that will help them to make sense of it all, and I don't. By nature, I'm a problem solver. I shine when I can help people, but I feel at my very worst when I just can't help solve people's problems. I think this is probably true for most guys, but especially for me. Pastors are often the first ones to hear about a spouse's dying. When a child is diagnosed with a serious disease, when a marriage is breaking apart, when someone doesn't make it through an operation. And if I can be transparent with you just for a moment, sometimes when you get a few of those in a row, it can just feel like it's just too much. Because while you want to help and to minister to people, the burden can become very heavy. Especially when you really don't have suitable answers for the people who are suffering. I had a friend in Brisbane that I knew from when I first became a Christian. We became good friends. He started having issues and eventually had a stroke that put him in a hospice bed for 18 months. The doctors told his wife that, you're never going to get him back home again. I had visited him just a few days before his stroke, and he was just fine. He'd been losing his sight, and he told me that it was kind of like always looking through a fog. He told me that he didn't want to get any sicker and that he was ready to go and be with the Lord. He would rather that happen than get any sicker, he told me. He was only my age, but he had been suffering with diabetes for a few years, and his health had kind of generally been going downhill. I prayed for him before I left, and he messaged me the next day saying that the fog had lifted, that he was seeing better, and that was awesome. When he told me that he was ready for death, I'm pretty sure that he didn't expect to be facing that real possibility just a few days later. Anyway, after about 18 months of being in a bed, he asked me to go and see him, and so, I was kind of worried that he was going to ask me, why me? And of course I didn't have an answer for that, but he didn't ask me that at all. Instead, he asked me to ask God to take him, because he was done with this life and he just wanted to go and be with God. And I'm glad that he had a perspective and an expectancy concerning eternity. His attitude was actually great. He was not at all resentful about his suffering and about his poor health. Instead, he was just looking forward to catching up with Jesus for a face-to-face. And I did pray for him. I don't think his family would have been happy about that, but I did pray for him, and I think he was gone 2 weeks later. Part of me didn't want to pray that. Part of me wanted him to stay for the sake of his wife and kids who loved him so much. The truth is that he knew that if he just let go of this life, that he was going to a better place, and the whole of his suffering would just come to an end. And you know what? This is true for every follower of Christ. There is coming a time when all the suffering that we have seen and experienced or are still enduring will come to an end. And so in some ways, perhaps unwelcomed ways, the suffering that we go through is a reminder that there is a better time just ahead of us. It should be a reminder that we in our current suffering situations are very temporal. We often sing a song that talks about a time when there will be no more sorrow. It comes from Revelation 21 verse 4. Let's read from verse 3. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, "Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever." A time is coming when there will be no one to tell me some bad news. There'll be no one there to say, "Hey, the doctor says it's cancer." There'll be no more evening news filled with war and murder and about parents abandoning their kids and about some brutal men just, killing children and so on. Suffering for the Christian should remind us that this life is going to come to an end soon. And when it does, the new life that God has planned for us will be even better than it was in the Garden of Eden. We will return to the kind of paradise that existed before this horror of sin, this sin pandemic, ever entered into the human environment. Then, as descendants of Adam and Eve, and as joint heirs with Christ, we will partake in the tree of life in the city of God. And no longer will we ever ask the question, why is life unfair? Because for the very first time we will live in a world that has not been stained with sin. and where all that we have waited for and longed for will finally be a present reality. This life is not all there is, and suffering is never desired, but it can serve a purpose. It can reinforce the need to understand that our actions have consequences. It can be an opportunity for the delivering work of God in our life, and it can reveal the genuineness of our faith. And finally, it can also remind us of our eternal destiny. But how do we react to our suffering? You know, the Bible provides no guarantee that we won't suffer. It just doesn't. What it does provide is that we can be sure that there'll be a way out, or that God will get us through. And so when suffering does come our way, as it most likely will at some stage, we have three basic choices that we can make. The first is that we can become distressed by the experience. When we compare our situations with others, we can certainly become distressed, especially when we see others less worthy than what we think ourselves are, cruise along in life while we're drowning in our suffering. And it seems that Asaph, the psalmist, got pretty bothered by this very thing. He says in Psalm 73, verse 3 and 5, "For I envied the proud when I saw them prosper despite their wickedness. They seem to live such painless lives. Their bodies are so healthy and strong. They don't have troubles like other people. They're not plagued with problems like everyone else." In your struggles, did you ever feel like it's only evil people who prosper? Have you ever felt like it's only the unethical people who get promotions and raises and bonuses and end up becoming rich? Have you ever wondered how people who dishonor God could end up with so much wealth and popularity in life? Well, so did Asaph. And it clearly bothered him. It's easy to feel that way when we look around and we see all the iniquities of life around us. It can cause us to be distressed, but being distressed doesn't really help. It doesn't help us through our own suffering. In fact, it just kind of aggravates it. And on top of being distressed, we can also become disillusioned. I don't know what was going on in Asaph's life, but if you read his whole psalm, you clearly see that he was struggling with this same question: why is life so unfair? He was struggling to reconcile his personal suffering with the prosperity of some of the wicked people in his life. Later on in the psalm, he says in 73, verse 13 and 14, "Did I keep my heart pure for nothing? Did I keep myself innocent for no reason? I get nothing but trouble all day long. Every morning brings me pain." I mean, if you get up in the morning and feel like that. He says basically, I'm wasting my time and energy trying to live a godly life. The godless around me seem like they're in better shape than I am, and life just doesn't seem fair. In the midst of his struggling to understand, Asaph turns to God for answers. And he asked him probably point blank this question: "God, why is life unfair?" But then he gets an eternal perspective. And so then he says in verse 16 and 17, "So I tried to understand why the wicked prosper, but what a difficult task it is. Then I went into your sanctuary, O God, and I finally understood the destiny of the wicked." After spending some time with the Lord, his perspective changes. His assurance of eternity reduces the impact of his suffering, and he sees not just what the wicked have that he doesn't have, but he sees what they don't have in comparison to him. And so he says in verse 23, "Yet I still belong." Where is it? Oh, here we go. "Yet I still belong to you. You hold my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, leading me to a glorious destiny. Whom have I in heaven but you? I desire you more than anything on earth. My health may fail me, my spirit may grow weak, but God remains the strength of my heart. He is mine forever." So it's okay, folks, to be real with ourselves and with one another, and especially with God. But our suffering or adversity doesn't have to severely distress us or make us disillusioned with life. Because if we can possibly lift our eyes off the pain and look to God, He will give us a perspective that will get us through, like He did with Asaph. When this happens, we can push through what is distressing our minds and push through the disillusionments in our spirit, and instead let it help us to become more devoted. Now we know that Jesus suffered greatly, but so have many other people over the years. And many of them have been His followers who even these days are suffering because of their faith in Him. I mean, this is something we don't really experience in Australia, and we can be grateful for that. But I'm telling you, all around the world, countless of our brothers and sisters are being persecuted for no reason other than their faith in Jesus. For example, about 10 years ago, Miriam Abraham, a 27-year-old doctor, was sentenced to 100 lashes for no reason other than because she married a Christian man whom the authorities in Sudan considered was adultery. Anyone who is a Muslim, if they married a Christian, it was as good as committing adultery. She was also sentenced to death by hanging because she refused to recant her faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. The courts considered her a Muslim because her father was a Muslim, even though he abandoned her when she was only 6 years old and left her to be raised by her Christian mother. The real story, apparently, is that her half-brother and half-sister wanted to steal her successful grocery store business, and so they schemed up this plan to put her in prison for apostasy and adultery. And so Jesus is not alone in His suffering, because the unfair suffering goes on even to this day because of people's faith in Jesus Christ. You know, some people will sometimes say to you, well, how do you know Jesus is real? He's just a figment of your imagination. Well, why would this woman a doctor be willing to die? Be willing to accept the punishment, the sentencing of death, rather than forsake her faith in Jesus Christ? I'll tell you why. Because Jesus had become very real to her, as He has become very real to me. Most of the disciples died because they refused to deny Jesus. You don't die because of an imaginary thing. You don't die because you think you might know something. You're willing to die for something that you absolutely know is true. Yes, Jesus, like many others, have suffered, but there was something unique about what Jesus suffered, and that is that He could have snapped His fingers any time and exited the planet and left us all in our misery. He could have done that, but instead He chose not to. And instead, through Jesus, God the Father Himself also experienced the worst of human circumstances, losing a child. There's no suffering that we can endure that God cannot relate to through experience. He has Himself gone through the whole human suffering experience, to the worst forms of pain and humiliation, defeat, despair, and even death. Jesus died forsaken by His followers. He died forsaken by His Father. He died ridiculed, mocked, tortured, beaten, enslaved, and naked, with nothing but a crown of thorns on His head. Jesus suffered because He knew that through His suffering He could reconcile us to God. For Him, He had no doubt that His suffering was worth it. When we raise our fists at Jesus and ask why life is unfair, He can say, "You're right. It is unfair, but I did something about that." He made our peace with God through His suffering, and He extends His arms, the same arms that were hung on a cross for you. He now extends to you and me with a willingness to embrace us in His love. And if there is anyone here today that has not yet asked Jesus to become part of their life and let Him embrace you in His love, He extends those same arms to you today. and He asks you to just let Him in. Can I have the team up, please? He says this to you. In Revelation 3 verse 20, He said, look, I stand at the door and knock. Think of that as the door of your heart. If you hear my voice and open the door, I'll come in and we will share a meal together as friends. Imagine being able to be friends with God. How awesome is that? And so if you want to invite Him in, if you're ready for that to happen, then please come see me as we sing this closing song, and I will gladly introduce you to the Savior of your soul. And if you have any other needs, well, we can ask God about those as well. And we can pray about that in Jesus' name. And all of God's people said? Amen. Amen indeed.